Epic v. Apple final ruling. We can actually talk about what the judge actually said and how they made their decisions based off of the case presented to them. And this has fallout to the rest of the game industry, and that's why we're covering it. We have like a final ruling from the California court that the initial case was brought to. So let's start covering that. What I'd like to do is go over the facts. Less discussion about what does it mean, and more discussion about like what actually happened, because the legal stuff is just hard to parse. It's hard to make sense of, and I think we can kind of run through that. So some main facts here is Judge Rogers, who's the court overseeing this whole thing, was in favor of Apple for 9 out of 10 counts, which Apple sees as a win, Epic sees as a loss, but there was
Yeah.
still major fallout from the rulings regardless.
Yeah.
So another thing, an interesting thing to bring up here is that the judge made it so that the case was isolated only to mobile gaming. So any of the rulings that were made are specific to mobile gaming only. It doesn't apply to mobile apps. It doesn't apply to gaming as a whole. It's just mobile
Mobile
gaming.
games. Yeah.
And I think that was a way for the judge to limit the fallout from it. I don't know her justification for it, but they limited the scope of this pretty significantly, even though mobile gaming is like a huge multi-billion-dollar business per year.
Yeah, I think there's a legal situation for reasonableness of applicability. That's not a legal term. It's just a conception where the idea is that, like, if you try to say the entire gaming market, and this is small piece, the burden for you to prove or disprove something is dramatically more complicated than to just say in this small area, which is the area we're going to consider.
Right.
Looking just in this walled garden, how do things operate? What is this is seen as a unit rather than the whole space, which you then have to break down and handle all completely in different areas. This is a way for them to focus, and at the same time, it makes it so that the ruling only applies to this tiny piece, and therefore can be argued more specifically.
The other thing is that the charges made by Epic focused around the fact that Apple had to be considered a monopoly. And there's reasons for which it could be reasonably applied and be called a monopoly, but the outcome was that the judge did not think that Apple could be considered a monopoly. In her words, she considered a duopoly, which I don't know if it's much better, because it just means there's two major, uh, you know, uh, I guess, market
Well,
holders, and
yeah.
that she did find some of their practices suspicious, or not suspicious, but anti-competitive. But basically, her idea was that because they only owned 55% of the market, that it wasn't enough of the market share for it to be considered a monopoly, and therefore antitrust laws in the case that it was a monopoly couldn't apply in this ruling.
What it does do is open up the possibility. It kind of narrows the area of concern for people, theoretically class action lawsuit lawyers or whatever, to start digging in and looking for evidence of collusion between the two heads of the duopoly by almost defining it as a duopoly and recognizing that there are really only two platform players here of any worth, like that there are only two options really for consumers. That has suddenly narrowed the scope for that type of conversation.
The general ruling on it did not shut the door on saying Apple isn't a monopoly. She considered a duopoly, but basically she said to Epic that they did not provide sufficient evidence for her to consider a monopoly and for them to be engaging in violating antitrust laws. But it does not mean that we did not find Apple to be in violation of antitrust laws. There wasn't a sufficient evidence that proved it so, and it keeps the door wide open for anybody else that wants to challenge it every large company has a bone to pick with Apple, so they're definitely not in the clear.
Yep.
All right, so 10 different rulings, or 10 different counts that
Yep.
were being pursued.
I will start with Judge Rogers identified. She determined that Apple was not a monopoly, even though they enjoy a ridiculously high margin on profits in their mobile game market.
Yeah. And basically, because she determined they were non monopoly, pretty much 9 out of the 10 cases fell. Like, there just wasn't enough evidence for her to find rulings in that. Uh, but we'll still go over them because it's important. Um, as such, because they're not monopoly, she couldn't find that they engaged in antitrust or violated antitrust laws for California and federally.
Apple did violate. This is a big one. Apple did violate California unfair competition laws in its anti-competitive behavior by disallowing any external payments to be used in the store applications.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But again, didn't amount to antitrust or monopolistic behavior, even though it was anti-competitive behavior.
Yeah.
Um,
What's interesting there as well is that Apple, like 4 days before the ruling or 8 days before the ruling, Apple had come out with a concession that they were going to allow exactly what the judge required of them, which was that they allow companies to offer the ability to learn more about how to buy things outside of the App Store like that marketplace, and use external payment systems or purchases of services and goods, um, that would effectively cut out Apple's 30% of their in-app purchase requirement right now.
right.
Um, it doesn't mean that the apps can be bought initially if it's not given away for free. That they can't, be if it's a $5.99 app, then it's still going to have to be 30% goes to Apple. But if you give it away for free and offer in-app purchases, now the conversation is different. Um, and that was something that Apple, I think every single detail was the same. Apple had made a concession that they would allow that going forward for, I think it was like a guaranteed 2 years or something like
Actually, I
that.
think it's even less than that. In that the concession that Apple provided, uh, there was less ruled on by the judge, and so they actually didn't have to compromise as much. I'll also say that like there was a bevy of anti-competitive allegations that were made by Epic, and basically she refused to acknowledge any of them and cast any sort of judgment on it. So unfair practices were kind of, as they alleged, felt they were without merit or enough merit for her to pass a ruling on it. So those were kind of ignored. Um,
Mhm.
she did state that the 30% revenue share was excessive for the what they provide as a value, but because there was no other models within the duopoly, there wasn't a model for her to suggest was better, so no ruling was made there either.
She did agree that Apple has a right to requiring in-app purchases, so that Apple can collect licensing fees for intellectual properties.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, can you dig into that a little bit?
Well, basically, it's when Epic challenged this through behavior, they would do in-app purchases, but they would go, "Here's one link that was to the like V-Bucks on Apple, and it's $9.99, and here's our link that's $7.99. You get a discount, but you buy it on the Epic store." And she found that Epic violated the terms of service, and they were required to actually pay the money back that they sort of skimmed off there.
Yeah,
But Apple has a right to require it as a license fee for using their intellectual properties. So in-app purchase is still allowed, and them requiring it is still allowed.
yeah.
The next point here, um, they have the right to maintain that their approval process for apps uh, is a result of maintaining security, and Apple has a right to pursue their security, so their current app review process can remain the same as well.
Judge Rogers disagreed with Apple's argument that app reviews that app reviews had to be tied to distribution of apps as a means to control malware and security issues.
Their argument was, and rightfully so, Epic says that they use the app review process to gate release of content in ways that are unfair. And Apple's argument was, well, no, it's a way to maintain security and prevent malware from going into the store. And her agreement was that they have a right to try to maintain security, but they're not. Them saying that the app review process is the only mechanism that secures this is not correct, and that there's other means to do this, in the way that they're using it is not entirely fair. Although no specific ruling about how they had to make changes was part of this final ruling.
Yeah, I think that to me means that if someone wanted to, they could potentially, take Apple to trial or court, not necessarily trial, but to court to discuss how the app reviews are used and to debate and suggest that they overstep their bounds with the current review process. What we don't know is data from Apple about how many rejections they have because of skeevy practices. So how many like of the users are saved from being tricked into downloading an app that steals information or does any number of questionable things. So there's all this data that I think was outside of the scope of the conversation, and that my read of it is that was like, nope, this is we I personally like I disagree that this is the way to do security and anti-malware stuff, but I'm not going to rule on it for the purposes of this trial.
What does this mean for the industry? Because we just kind of went over how the ruling went, but most of it had no teeth in it. Most of it was not enforcing any specific actions,
Yep,
besides the 2 points, which were Epic had to pay $3.5 million back to Apple for them breaking the rules and allowing users to purchase V-Bucks and other items directly through the Epic Store in the app, in which was against Apple's policies. So they had
at the
to
time.
compensate for that. The other ruling was that Apple has to allow apps now to link out to
Other payment
yeah,
options.
other payment options, because this, I think, was the most enforceable anti-competitive behavior that the judge saw that they could take action on.
Actually, it's not that. They do not have to allow their users or the applications in the store that directly link to other payment options. They have to allow apps that allow users to click a button that shows them how to bypass the in-app purchase that goes through Apple. It's actually a really subtle difference, but it is a major headache for app developers, right? Like, whereas in the past, if you mentioned in your app, click here to find out how to save 25% on the purchase, or just click here to buy it now, right? Like, I can just click the button and buy it. Or I can click and save some money because I'm going through a different payment service that doesn't charge as much. It charges 5% instead of 30% for the same transaction. Um, what they're not allowing is those apps to do a direct payment inside of the app, or as a the way that you would have it with the App Store. What they're allowing or requiring that Apple allow is the ability for people to click a link where they can learn how to do it, or allow users to sign up to receive communications outside of the app from the companies so that they can learn how to do it.
But Apple cannot at this point disallow it or reject an app
Right.
on those grounds at this point. So because it wasn't found as a monopoly case, it antitrust lawsuit couldn't be pushed against them, and basically they said there's too much competition in the market for that to be considered, and there wasn't like a firm ruling on a lot of the practices that a lot of developers dislike and that are kind of anti-consumer at times. Um, so not a huge win for anybody, but it now looks like Apple and Google, because Google was named in this lawsuit in the first place, will not be able to bar apps from being on their marketplace that have methods to link out and circumvent the in-app purchases to
Right.
make purchases on a separate website. Um, but is this over, Eric?
No,
No.
this is far from over. You know, when the headlines first hit, everyone was like, Apple forced to allow blah, blah, blah. And even Apple's stock went down something like 2 point something percent briefly. Um, and when you read the fine print, like the headlines made it seem like Apple lost, Epic won. It was a big, yeah, Epic was going to be happy. But when you read in the articles, Apple was like, we are happy to hear that the courts have affirmed what we've known all along, that this is exactly, we are not a monopoly. This is just, like our platform and this is our rules. And, they kind of didn't, they kind of brushed over the whole anti-competitive thing, that one count that they were held to account for. Um, at the same time, they were said like, "This is great. This is what we knew all along." Epic, Tim Sweeney, CEO of Epic, came on and had he blasted a tweet. I guess he tweeted out that uh, Epic was disappointed in the ruling and that things were I can't remember exactly the terms. It sounded like it wasn't going to be the end. And of course, I think within a day or two, the appeal was filed by Epic to get this rehashed in a higher level court.
Yeah, the Ninth Circuit Court is what's being appealed to, which is it's an appeals court. Um,
Yeah,
but if it gets challenged there, it can advance and it can start making its way to the Supreme Court, which seems like may continue to be challenged if they're not satisfied with the results. And I think they're going to be really pushing for the fact that like a duopoly exists, and the amount of market share that Apple has and it's been growing is not acceptable for the way that they currently operate their app store.
yeah,
So we'll see. We'll keep updating it as it happens, but at this point, there should probably be quite a bit of a lull until the appeals court actually gets around to hearing this, which will probably be not anytime soon.